Hello, everyone, and welcome to the IRDR Masters Taster Lecture. Please be aware that we are recording this and this will go on YouTube. So I'm happy to take questions in the chat and I will not read out your name if you want to remain anonymous. Otherwise, it's actually no problem for you to simply unmute yourself, turn on your video or not, but it does mean that the whole world will be watching and will have access to whatever you say. And finally, although I'm going to be talking a lot about my work and who I am in my research, we do have Alexandra Middleton here, who is a current master's student, and she can actually indicate to you what aspects of the current program are like. She can answer any questions if you just want to say hello quickly, Alex.
Hi everyone, I'm Alex. Nice to meet you. Any questions that you have about the course, I'm more than happy to answer at the end.
Sounds good. Thanks so much. And now it looks like actually earlier it may not have been on me, so you may have been hearing a disembodied voice, but it looks like Zoom has clicked in, so you should now be hearing and seeing me. Of course, if there's any problems, just put a message in the chat, we'll pick it up and try and correct everything and anything. So thank you again. And who am I and why am I talking to you? Well, I'm Ilan Kelman. I'm an academic staff member at University College London, and I do teach on the master's program to which you applied to, and hopefully you will be joining us. I'm 50% actually in the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction, 50% at IRDR, and the other 50% of me is at the Institute for Global Health, the UCL Institute for Global Health, IGH. The idea of connecting me between disasters and health, well, we probably worked that out given the pandemic situation. This is what we didn't want. This is what we were hoping to avoid. This is what the warning signs were there for weeks, if not months, before the situation really hit. This is what people have been talking about for decades. There are textbooks on this, and yet we still ended up with an immense global disaster. So clearly, there's a lot of work to do. Clearly, there's so much more that we have to understand and try to work to get our science into policy and practice, because no one ever wants to go through this again. And it is so frustrating that, in fact, it should not even have happened in the first place. Which might be, what, a rather odd, provocative, strange statement? Why would I say that? This is where the science comes in. This is where we start from the fundamentals and say, well, okay, so sure, I'm a professor of disasters and health. So disasters, health, what does it mean to bring them together? In fact, even what is a pandemic? Or let's start more basic. What is a disaster? So these are the discussions that we have. And I've just put in the chat my contact details. So do feel free to connect with me on social media. These discussions should not be stopping here. They should not be stopping simply because you've clicked on a YouTube video. They should not be stopping in the classroom. We've seen the damage. We see what's going on. And this has to be a continual approach in terms of what we're doing to try and prevent these situations arising, which means we really need to understand where they're coming from. So it sort of goes back to that fundamental scientific question. Well, what is a disaster? So if anyone wants to sort of start off, we can go on via Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, as I put in the chat, but let's start off here. If anyone wants to guess what is a disaster, feel free to type a couple of words, a couple of ideas into the chat. If you want to unmute yourself and start speaking, that's fine. Again, reminder that it will be on YouTube. So we understand why we're in this situation. We now have to get out of it and then stop it happening again, which really means that we need to work out what is a disaster. So does anyone have thoughts? Does anyone have ideas? Does anyone have suggestions on what is a disaster? And I guess no one has unmuted yourself. I don't see anything in the chat. So there we go. Someone has said an event that causes great damage. I mean, actually, perfectly fair. Makes a lot of sense. It's easy to communicate. It's not using particular jargon. It's not using particularly difficult words. Someone else has then added when there's loss of life. So we're talking about humans being affected, absolutely. Someone says sudden and usually an accident. Now, accident is a very interesting word because it does convey the idea that, you know what, we couldn't have stopped it, we couldn't have dealt with it. Whatever happened, happened, it's an accident, move on. What we try and convey is that none of this should be surprising. None of this should be an accident. If we are able to avoid surprise, if we are able to avoid accident, then we're actually doing what we're in this for, risk and disaster reduction, health prevention, trying to avoid the situation. And of course, the media love the phrase, which is called black swan. Black swan is kind of seen as what? A huge accident. Of course, we couldn't foresee, we couldn't think about. No one ever understood what it was about with huge impacts. But the point of understanding disasters is that there should be no black swans. I've even seen scientists publish papers saying, well, Hurricane Katrina in 2005 was a black swan, except that they ran a hurricane simulation in New Orleans the year before called the Hurricane PAM exercise. And the consequences of Hurricane PAM in theory were remarkably, frighteningly close to what happened with Hurricane Katrina in reality. Besides which, New Orleans had been slammed by hurricanes before, like Camille and Betsy. So no, Hurricane Katrina was not a black swan. Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Irma in the 2017 hurricane season, again, they've been called black swans. They were not black swans. And of course, the pandemic has been called a black swan. But as I said, we knew this was coming. We had decades, as well as for a pandemic in general, as well as weeks for COVID, if not months. So yeah, we try and avoid these concepts of, oh, it was surprising, it was shocking. We try and avoid these ideas of an accident or surprise because we understand disaster. We know what we have to do about it. And fundamentally, the key is often we do not. And then finally, a very useful comment, actually, an initially uncontrollable situation. And initially uncontrollable, that often appears to be the case. Unfortunately, that often is the case. What we hope you will do with your masters is to ensure that they do not lose control, that these situations occur, but because we had anticipated it, because we'd acted beforehand, we actually avoid the loss of life, which one person mentioned in the chat. We avoid the suddenness, which comes through very clearly in a lot of interpretations of disaster, and we avoid the issue of the lack of controllability. Now, Alex has put in the chat a very interesting comment, disasters are not natural, which really hits the heart of what we try and do when we're trying to understand what a disaster is. So the question itself is both academic and practical. There are books written with the title, What is a Disaster? And they don't reach a conclusion. Welcome to academia, talk, write, never agree on anything. The UN, the Red Cross, Red Crescent, governments in legislation define disasters. And of course, go to dictionary, right? Just look at the word disaster, look at a thesaurus, look at definitions. Also, I suspect that, or I hope that almost everyone on this call speaks more than one language. Think about terms like disaster, catastrophe, calamity, emergency, translate them into all the languages you know, and determine, is there a one-to-one correspondence? Does it actually work? So I've gone through this. I've read these wonderful books that don't reach a conclusion. I've read a lot of disaster-related legislation. I've thought about the different terms in the various languages, which I can sort of get buy-in, looked at dictionaries in those languages, as well as English dictionaries. And I tried to distill it into a phrase or an idea, a concept, which is hopefully linguistically and culturally translatable, but which also tries to encapsulate a lot of the key concepts you put in the chat while setting aside what we don't want to happen. So I suggest that disaster is a situation requiring outside support for coping. A situation requiring outside support for coping. That does have vagueness, a situation. Outside support, when it's a pandemic, how do you support outside the globe? Or is it about support outside one's own circle, city, country? And also for coping, what does that really mean? Some people do manage to get through tragedy, through devastation, yet still cope with it. On the other hand, what it does say is that we can assist each other, we can help. It does say there is a way forward, whatever this coping means. And it is deliberately vague in terms of using situation or circumstance, not saying that it's an event which we can identify, which we can say in time or in space, the disaster was there at that point. It's a situation which may extend beyond usual boundaries. What does this actually mean? We have the concept then, which, is hopefully fairly intuitive. It at least suffices for the languages in which I can work in. How we get there, how we end up with this situation which people cannot cope with, that in itself is a challenge. Because disaster tends to break down into two much more difficult concepts, much more difficult words, in that disaster risk comprises hazard and vulnerability. Two words which we use in English and make sense, but are actually not typically translatable into many other languages. So what do they mean? Well, we're speaking English, or at least some bizarre variation of it. So what does hazard mean in English? If we're thinking about disasters, put in the chat, what examples of hazard might you have? What do we mean when we speak about hazard as contributing to disaster risk? Again, just type them out or feel free to unmute yourself to determine what do we actually mean by this word hazard. And the silence in the chat may be indicative. Oh, we're getting something. Okay, so people are saying, yeah, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions. Again, the geological ones, earthquakes and volcanoes, seem to be very popular. Keep on going. How quickly can you type? Yeah, threats to life and property. I mean, that's a very intriguing approach to it. Rather than saying it is this specific phenomenon, it's actually more general that if that threat is there, that then becomes a hazard. And keep that thought because we'll come back to it. Terrorist attacks. So is the attack itself a hazard? Are the people perpetuating it a hazard? Are those behind the scenes actually creating the situation a hazard? Because hazard is a rather vague word. So it is interesting that when we start getting into people causing problems for us in a manner like a terrorist attack, ambiguity starts to emerge. And biological pathogen, which obviously comes back to COVID-19. When I sort of said that there has to be, or that comment in the chat, threats to life and property, that there has to be that form of threat for something to be hazardous. Let's go to sort of the first two which were mentioned, and that's earthquakes. Because plenty of earthquakes happen with no disaster. We get the earthquake, we do not get a disaster. This means that the hazard itself does have to have that concept of threats to life and property before it becomes hazardous. And someone has just put in the chat, hazard is a prospective event acting upon a certain pattern in time and space, which again is very clever because it's not trying to pinpoint. Again, it's saying that something is happening which can be more generic, but there still has to be that acting upon a certain pattern, with that pattern effectively being a disaster or being death and damage. So can something be hazardous, not potentially hazardous? Can something be hazardous unless people are hurt? Which goes back to the earthquakes. So I can give an example that 28th February 2001, Seattle in the Northwest US was rocked by an earthquake of 6.8 moment magnitude with a depth of 52 kilometers. So fairly substantive, but not excessive, and fairly shallow it was felt. We don't really remember the big Seattle earthquake of 2001 because there was no disaster. A few people were said to have died from heart attacks, but there were no deaths from building collapses. There were no deaths from bridge collapses. Part of it was luck. There were a lot of aspects which went into the time of that earthquake. Part of it was that Seattle had spent 3 decades retrofitting their infrastructure against earthquakes and preparing and training their population to deal with these sorts of situations. This means that the earthquake was not in particular that hazardous. So was the earthquake a hazard or not? Because there was no disaster. Now, some bridges were damaged. Fortunately, no one was on them. Those were bridges which were scheduled for retrofitting. The bridges which had been retrofitted against seismic hazards didn't fail. So Seattle, 2001, 6.8. Then northern Japan, an earthquake more than 10 times as big as the Seattle one on the 26th of September 2003 hit northern Japan. That was 8.3 at a depth of 27 kilometers. So even much shallower, and boy, would it be felt. That is a massive earthquake. And the death toll was 1. One person was killed after when they were cleaning up glass and they were hit by a car. So we have a massive, massive hazard or potential hazard, but no disaster. So why should Japan worry on the 26th of December 2003? It's just an earthquake. Maybe not that hazardous and definitely not an earthquake disaster. Then we can go back across the Pacific to California. So 22 December 2003, where an earthquake just slightly weaker than the Seattle one, that was at 6.5, very shallow, 8 kilometers. And the death toll for that, you'd feel it. It's not a huge earthquake, but you'd feel it. The death toll from that one was 2. 2 people exited a building during the shaking, which is a very bad idea if you think the infrastructure is okay. A clock tower, which was not seismically retrofitted, collapsed, fell on them and killed them. Had they actually followed appropriate earthquake behavior instructions, which if you hope the building is going to stand up, you drop, cover, and hold, like under a table, under something solid and hold on, then it would have been fine. And as it turned out, the owner of that building was criminally charged and was found guilty. So they should have seismically retrofitted that clock tower, and then the death toll would have been 0. This means that we have so many good news stories about earthquakes, but we're still getting earthquake disasters, right? Haiti, 10th of January or 12th of January 2010, where it was perhaps one of the largest earthquake-related death tolls in human history, certainly over 200,000, maybe up to 300,000. Notice I said earthquake-related, not earthquake-caused, because Seattle, Japan, California, we have examples of earthquakes, but no disaster. So interestingly, Haiti, big problem. Same, 4 days after that California earthquake, 26 December 2003, there was an earthquake which was very similar in southern Iran. So it was 6.7 compared to the California one, moment magnitude 6.5. And the southern Iran earthquake was at 10 kilometers depth compared to California, 8 kilometers. California death toll 2, southern Iran death toll 25,000. Sometimes an earthquake absolutely can be hazardous. And someone's put in the chat, absolutely L'Aquila 2009, where magnitude was not the only key, which is absolutely right. It's time of day, its depth, and its nature of the shaking. So L'Aquila actually had a foreshock where which didn't cause a lot of casualties. And people said, oh no, this is not good. We better not stay in our buildings. They may not stand up. Let's go outdoors. And a number of people who were in positions of authority actually said, no, go back to your houses and sleep. There's no problem. So the people thought, well, this isn't a great idea, but they listened to the people who were telling them to go back into their houses. The main shock struck and over 300 people were killed in that earthquake, most of them in collapsed buildings or collapsing buildings. So that was an example where many lives could potentially have been saved. And I say potentially because it went to a court case. Some people were found guilty. There have been appeals, and there's been a lot of discussion about, number one, whether or not the individuals who told people to go back to their houses should have been criminally charged, and also whether or not the verdicts were correct. It's not just about understanding seismology. It's not just about understanding the engineering of the structures. It suddenly gets into law. It gets into ethics, it gets into risk communication. Or in the cases of Haiti and Iran, it's about why places with a known earthquake hazard, with centuries to prepare, and with centuries of experience of damaging earthquakes, why we're talking about major death tolls in 2003 and in 2010. So why does this happen? Well, it goes to that other component of disaster risk. I mentioned it's hazard and vulnerability. And so for all this discussion is simply about, has been about the ground shaking. But all that is a ground shaking. We saw in Seattle, Japan, and California that the ground shaking does not need to lead to a disaster. We have to focus on these other elements, away from the environment, away from the earthquake, away from the seismology, away from the specific calculations going into engineering of buildings, onto the vulnerability, about why the knowledge, like of how to engineer buildings, was not applied. So what is vulnerability? Well, vulnerability is a process. It's a social process involving culture, involving politics, basically involving people, which lets some groups in society be harmed by perfectly typical environmental events, of which we've been talking about, earthquakes. How do groups in society let others be harmed? Well, by not having planning regulations, by not having building codes, or by having perfect regulations and perfect building codes which are on the books, which are then not monitored, not enforced, not followed. In fact, in the 1999 earthquake in Turkey, a lot of the buildings which collapsed, to some extent, should have been constructed in a much better manner, because there were seismic codes out there, you know, binding or not really the issue. The issue is obeying them, is actually following them. So known seismic zone, you're constructing infrastructure, which you know is going to collapse in an earthquake if you don't build it properly. And in some places they do, and in some places they don't. So this is creating vulnerability for others. This is people saying, I just want to put up the block of flats, make my money and get away. And if they die later, it's not my problem. This is a creation of vulnerability. This is a social, political, cultural systems which lack the regulations or lack the monitoring or lack the enforcement. This is not permitting certain groups to go to school. So they're not educated enough to say, oh, is this building seismic resistant? Am I in a seismic zone? This is about marginalizing people so they cannot afford proper accommodation. This is even providing information in manners which may not be accessible. For example, people with disabilities. If you only provide what I'm doing now, like oral English, then many people who do not communicate in this manner are simply left out. They're simply marginalized. If it's only English, ce serait qu'il y aura beaucoup de problèmes parce que personne ne comprend pas la langue. So this is where we can make decisions within ourselves in order to ensure that everyone gets involved, that everyone has information, that everyone knows what the possible situations are and how to rectify any problems. But this cannot be done overnight. Imagine if I were giving this lecture in French, not very good French, as you might have heard, but certainly some manner of French. Not everyone on this call may be able to fully understand. You're not going to learn French overnight, which means that we're talking a long-term process of creating vulnerability. Certainly, building infrastructure, promulgating legislation, ensuring that people with disabilities are viewed as people, not with disabilities, but as people, giving them the access, the resources, the opportunities that people without disabilities have, that will not be done overnight or in a week or in a month. That takes decades. This is generational, which is why vulnerability takes a long time to build up and to force on people. But the disaster comes from vulnerability, not the earthquake, not the hazard, which means that the disaster takes a long time to happen. The disaster takes a long time to manifest. The disaster is a long-term process We do not refer to disasters as events. We refer to them as societal processes. If we are to tackle them, it also takes a long time. Where do you begin to go into a seismic zone and say, we don't want 100,000 people dying, so we need to change our infrastructure. And to change that infrastructure, you need people who are trained. To change that infrastructure, you need the legislation. To change that infrastructure, you need to have a population which has a certain level of education, a certain level of resources, a certain level of opportunities to understand the situation they are in and how to avoid that earthquake disaster. Knowing an earthquake must happen, but the disaster does not necessarily need to happen. To get everyone involved in this manner, to ensure that the individual right through to the national approaches and structures and systems are in place, this takes time. Even that simple phrase, drop, cover, and hold. You have to understand what that means. You have to have confidence your structure will stand up, and you have to be ready to drop, cover, and hold when the shaking begins. And exactly as the comment in the chat says, vulnerability adds up or accrues or compounds over time in very hidden, very invisible, very nested fashions. This is the insidious nature of vulnerability. This is a pernicious characteristic of disaster, not just happening over the long term as a long process, but also that if we're not looking, we're not necessarily going to be aware of it. Geology is not easy. Going out to a place like the Apennines or like the Andes and saying, oh, the fault is right there, this is what's going to happen, this is a possible magnitude, this is a type of depth, this is the kind of shaking we may get. It's not easy, but at least we have the techniques and we know what's going on. To go to a community in the Chilean Alps, to go to a community on the spine of Italy, and to look around and say, okay, who's going to die? Which buildings are going to collapse? How long is it going to take until we get emergency services in here? We need so much more work. Some wonderful, wonderful people who've done really fantastic a job in this. Fundamental science, basic research, but then bringing that into policy and practice. But there's a lot of guessing. There's a lot of estimations because we don't always know what we cannot see. We do not always know that people with disabilities are in that building, that people who do not speak Italian or Chilean Spanish are in that building, and they don't have access, and this is why they don't have access, and this is how we're going to change it. And the national government did this, and the local government did this, and there was corruption over there, but then this scientist came along and made a mistake and said the wrong thing. Trying to determine that, trying to understand that is exactly the hidden, nestled vulnerabilities as per the comment in the chat. So much is invisible. So much of our job that it is scientifically defensible, that it is robustly and verifiably evidenced, and then thinking about how do we then communicate it? How do we get these ideas and trying to ensure that those with the power to act not only want to act, but actually do act. You know, it's all very well to say, well, just give a YouTube lecture, just bring in our master students and give them a taster lecture, just go out and campaign for someone, vote, go out and stand for office yourself. You could be prime minister. That's easy to say. But what if you're in a country where we cannot vote? What if we're in a country which is passing legislation in a democratic process to restrict the right to vote? I am so privileged that whatever I say here, I'm going to sleep well tonight. I'm not going to worry that suddenly in the middle of the night, I'll get a knock on my door, or more likely my door kicked in, with a bunch of people coming in and arresting me to torture me without trial, without accusation, and possibly even up to execution, without accusation, without any rights. I'm not in that position. So many people around the world, even if they speak up legitimately, their life is in danger. They don't have access to YouTube. They don't have access to a computer or the internet to give this sort of talk, to listen to this sort of talk, to be able to put really good comments in the chat. They don't have these options to say, let me go and try and just do a web search and try and find out my seismic zone here, or kind of knock on the walls and, oh, do I think this is going to stand up in an earthquake? The vast majority of the population do not have these options or opportunities. Someone else has the power. Someone else has the resources. And if they don't care about people dying in an earthquake or a pandemic or a flood or a heat wave, then we're going to get disasters. Breaking through these invisible barriers, finding out what's hidden and bringing it to the light. This is the fundament of disaster research, while ensuring that our research goes into policy and practice. And as you see, it takes a lot of time to try and convey. And do keep on putting comments into the chat so I can respond to them. Because what we need is sort of your feedback saying, well, what messages are useful? What messages make sense? What is a disaster and how do we stop it? So we come up with these pithy phrases like disasters are not natural, which was put into the chat, such as what I said, disaster is not an event. It's a process. And because it's a process coming from the long-term vulnerability process, disasters do not happen quickly. All disasters happen slowly. You know, the earthquake hits, maybe you get 30, 60 seconds warning, and then suddenly the shaking happens for, again, 30 seconds or 60 seconds, and you can have a city or country devastated, as with Haiti. That happens quickly. But the disaster was a chronic poverty, poor infrastructure, lack of opportunities, consolidation of power, corruption, amassing of resources away from the people. That was the disaster that brought Haiti down. It was not the 60 seconds of shaking in January 2010. So all disasters happen slowly because it took decades, centuries, for Haiti to get into a position that the country would be shattered by simply an earthquake. And same with Iran. That place in southern Iran where most people were killed on 26 December 2003 was actually a World Heritage City. It was known for its construction. It was known for its architecture. It was known for its design, which means it was known it was seismically vulnerable. And that was not the first earthquake to have hit that area. Yet people over decades, through politics, social choices, culture, apathy, ignorance, made decisions not to worry about seismic vulnerability. And so over 25,000 people were killed on that day. But that decision was not made overnight. It was made over the long term, which means that disasters do not happen quickly. So we have these phrases, disasters are not natural, disasters are not events, disasters don't happen quickly. People are making decisions about power, about resources, about allocation, about different approaches of how we're forced to live, of where we live, of how we live in different ways. Someone is making those decisions, and some of us have the power. I certainly have, hopefully to some degree, power of information, power of exchange with you to try and understand what to do about these disasters. Someone is making these choices, which leads to the final phrase, and that's sort of the theme of this lecture, a book which I published last year called Disaster by Choice. Disasters are a choice. They're the choice of those making those decisions, which means that we can do plenty about them. So disasters are not accidents. Disasters should not be surprises. Disasters should not be shocks. And we really need to get rid of the phrase black swan in the same way that we need to get rid of the phrase natural disaster, which really is a summary of what we try and convey in the master's degree. It really is a summary of that book, Disaster by Choice. It really is a summary of the message that I'm communicating here. And that comes from research. I can also tell you very clearly, it's not my idea. It was around, it was accepted long before I was around, long before I was accepted. Yet we still don't implement it. Look at any headlines, we still see natural disaster being used. So colleagues started a media campaign to try and stop the phrase natural disaster. They were successful in getting certain United Nations agencies to stop using the phrase natural disaster. Some journalists have responded very positively. A good proportion of scientists have responded very positively to stop using this phrase natural disaster. So this is a very clear example of a basic scientific idea, which we can back up with a book or with a 30-minute lecture, or if you want, decades of science, in order to get that into a simple distilled message and then into policy and practice for action. And that is very much what we try to do. That's very much what we hope that you will do with your degree and why we're here, to do that basic fundamental research, to learn, but then to exchange and try and get these messages into the realms where people will make decisions. And we do that in the classroom. So UCL is a research intensive university. UCL does try and ensure we bring our research into the classroom, and we design our modules and sessions around our own projects and our own interests in order to bring it directly to you. So even in terms of the question in the chat now, so that absolutely that comes from a fundamental basis of what we're trying to do in disaster research. What is the balance, if any, between intentional, deliberate disaster by choice and cascading low-level neglect? And I'd say they're no balance. They are the same. Low-level neglect can be explained. People don't have power, don't have interest, or they have apathy, or they lack resources. That means that someone who's not low level, or someone with more power who may still be low level, has to is making that decision for them, is forcing on them disaster by choice. So someone somewhere within that chain, within the networks, within the systems, is still making that choice of neglect. Do we blame that low-level planner? Do we blame that low-level emergency manager? Well, my response is if you're a planner or emergency manager, you're not low-level. You are the people we need. And it was fascinating during the pandemic how they said only essential workers need to go out to work. Everyone else should stay home. So who turned out to be essential workers? Well, amongst the lowest paid. People stocking the supermarket shelves, nurses, people driving the buses. Well, apparently they weren't essential before the pandemic, given their working conditions and salaries. Whereas the people controlling us, the heads of multinational corporations, who just throw $1 billion to go up to space or throw $1 billion because they can, well, they were suddenly not essential workers. So even where we say low level, they are actually not low whatsoever. It's often the people at the top, the decision makers, who are achieving the lowest level, and it's those dying in disasters or those helping us survive disasters who are treated the worst and who actually ought to be at the highest level. So by creating society in this fashion, we are still doing disaster by choice, which means that the two concepts in that question in the chat really come together. And again, we go through this in our teaching, we go through this in the modules. It's not just about earthquakes, it just happened earthquakes came up first in the chat today, so I focused on that. But we could talk the same about pandemics. We could talk the same about the wildfires, which are going all over Oregon at the moment. We could talk about the heat wave, which hit Western Canada and Western US last month. We could talk about the floods, which have devastated China today, Henan, and which hit Western Europe over the past few days. The whole story, the whole disaster by choice story is the same. And we try and convey that through the degree. We try and convey that through our research intensive teaching, our research-based teaching, because it comes from science. It comes from the evidence, it comes from the research. It does mean that we try and get these messages out beyond the classroom. As I said, this is not just about today. This is not just about YouTube. This is not just about your master's degree. This is saying, how do we change the way people are thinking and acting based on this decades of science, which we can sort of distill into a talk or a pithy phrase? And so, for example, just yesterday, I had one article published in the Washington Post, which I'm just going to put that link into the chat, which was trying to say that too much has come out and blamed these Western European floods on climate change. All climate change did was give more rainfall. That's all it did. All climate change did was give more rainfall. But in the same way that an earthquake is not a disaster, rainfall is not a disaster. Rainfall is fairly well linked to floods. Obviously, you get water from the sky, it hits the ground, it can flood. But a flood is just a hazard side. A flood says nothing about vulnerability. A flood does not need to mean a flood disaster. Even in the context of worse rainfall from climate change, people quite rightly looked at the history of many of the places which were just destroyed last week and found, you know what, flash floods have happened relatively frequently in those places. They are known as floodplains. They've been hit before by floods. So one headline says, climate scientists shocked by disaster. I'm really sorry to say, I was not shocked. No one who I worked with was shocked by what happened in Western Europe over the last week. And simply by looking at local history, looking at local planning, looking at the local relationship between the river and the settlements, they were very unfortunately disasters waiting to happen. No accident, no surprise, no shock. So we do try and deal with the media, and I'm doing a half-hour media panel later this afternoon also, asking the same questions. What went wrong? When we knew all this, why could we not avert the disaster? And are we actually going to change anything in order to try and do better in the future? So it's different modes of communication. It's different manners of communication. We're looking at art. I've had a couple of projects where we've worked with professional poets to take our science and to produce a joint poem based on the science, but also trying to make it appropriate poetry. And if you look up experimental words on YouTube, experimental words, then you can find our album, you can find the poem which I co-read with the professional poet who I worked with, trying to convey these ideas to a much wider audience. Does it work? I mean, that's up to you to tell me. And please start the questions coming in the chat, or get ready to unmute yourself if you don't mind talking, to ask me questions and to challenge me. Because it's easy for me to say disaster by choice. It's easy for me to say, you better listen to me. But is it working? Is it effective? That's where we all need to work together to improve, to critique each other, and to say, well, this works in one context, it doesn't work in another. So we're all trying to move forward to address disasters, to point out that disasters are not natural, they are not events, they do not happen quickly, to try to ensure that people understand the real causes of disaster, and to move forward to ensure that the horrible situations we've mentioned, like the Iran earthquake, like the Haiti earthquake, actually end up becoming successes, like the Japan earthquake, like the Seattle earthquake, like the California earthquake. It's not all doom and gloom. We have a lot of examples where it has worked, like with the earthquakes. And so it's up to us to say, how can we better communicate the messages in order to show the successes without assuming it will always be successful? So we do need to highlight the failures also, but not getting people despondent by saying it's all failure, it's all problematic, it's all troublesome. This is hopefully why you'll come and do your degree with us. This is hopefully what you're seeking from your degree. And more to the point, this is hopefully what we are conveying. So thank you very much. Again, please put questions in the chat. Feel free to just jump in and mute yourself. If you want to know more about the actual program, Alex is here, she can respond. Or if there's no questions, then I'll just talk for another 4 hours. That does not bother me. Anyone want to type anything or just talk?
Hello, Ilan. Hi, this is Umberto. I was wondering, the one of the last few things that you said was just does not take my words for granted. This made me think back to something that I read on the National Geographic a few years ago, when the IPCC 2015 report was released. Um, um, a story on the National Geographic reported that one of the authors did explain that her father was completely not believing a single word, not taking a single word of the report. Let's say that he was a climate changer denier of whatever the definition could be. The only point when her father eventually gave up his resistance, so to say, was when she literally shouted to him and asking or almost begging him, "Do you believe me? Do you believe me?" So the what you're subtly reminding us is that sometimes it's not just, well, probably most of the times, maybe it's not just science and well-crafted messages that are going to hit the point in people's minds and hearts, but something else, feelings, maybe, as this story reminds. And I can't help wondering, how can we build the non-technical message, the meta message, if you will, into risk communication? Isn't it a monstrous challenge?
It is a monstrous challenge. That's why it's so much fun. And that's why we better start today. If we just say, well, you know, whatever, then people are going to die. There's going to be disasters. That's why we're in the career. I hope that's why you're coming to do your degree. How do we do it? For me, there's not a single solution. Some people will have a mature professional discussion, will look for the evidence, and will come to a rigorous, defendable conclusion on the basis of that. Some people have no interest in reading tweets, let alone encyclopedia. So as you said, some respond to feeling, some respond to emotion. Some people prefer a scientific paper of 14,000 words. Some people prefer a haiku. Some people will prefer watching a 2-hour movie. Some prefer a Zoom YouTube lecture. People are different, and that's fine. It would be very boring if we all responded similarly. So it's not about saying, well, there's the authority scientist figure, just listen to them and they'll tell you everything they know. No, I make mistakes. I'm changing how I do things all the time based on feedback from people like you and through social media, as well as other forms of discussions. So people respond differently, which is good, which means we need to think differently about how we exchange, about how we learn and teach each other, and about the different media that we use and the different approaches that we use in order to distill the similar messages and communicate them. It's not easy, because a message which is effective for one group may completely turn off another group. So if we then do something opposite for the other group, it seems disingenuous or hypocritical. What I can say is the consistency is that the evidence is there if people will look for it or if they want us to provide it. What I can say is that the messages can be distilled very clearly, what a disaster is, where a disaster comes from. And so it's just about partitioning that out in different ways to reach different audiences. And we need feedback in terms of what works and what doesn't work. And Alex, there's a question in the chat for you.
Hi, Jamie. I was just typing a response. I didn't want to interrupt. Did I have any experience in this field before? No, not really, but I was a nurse in A&E, so kind of on a smaller scale for a long time before I started working in the prison system. I started working within Belmarsh, and yeah, just as an older student decided to do my MSc. And I didn't have an idea what I wanted to do career-wise, but I'm actually starting a PhD in October, which would never have entered my thought process to think that that was something I could achieve. But yeah, this MSc has been life-changing, really. So yeah, that's what's happening for me in the future.
So it was a good idea to do this career shift.
Yeah, it certainly was.
That's the correct answer. You will pass your degree.
That was, yeah, you know, I'm your number one fan, the best advocate for the course.
What made you decide to do your PhD?
Because I really enjoyed learning and research, and yeah, which I'd never really done before. I'd never really explored. I'm still a little bit nervous about doing it, but the opportunity to do something like that is just phenomenal. I've used my MSc project as a pilot for the PhD, so hopefully that means it'll take the pressure off a little bit when I start in October.
And then you'll become an IRDR staff member?
Yes.
And do a taster lecture for new master's students?
Maybe one day, yeah, for sure.
Who else?
I also had a question that was in the chat. I mean, it was a private message, but I don't think Jacob would mind if I shared, about things that I could prepare for before we started. It's not a plug, but I did read Ilan's book. I also, David Alexander's Principles of Emergency Planning is a really good book to get hold of, invaluable. Interesting book, Linda Polman, The Crisis Caravan, just a nice evening read. And for the course IRDR 015, I hadn't done maths since 1996, so I wish I'd swatted up on a bit of statistics and probability, but there's lots of YouTube videos on Bayes' theorem, so I've found that are useful, and a GIS program and R. But if you've been in study, you'll probably know all of these programs. It's just because I'm an older student, but I can put my details in the chat if anybody wants them to ask any questions.
And we do provide extra math support. The students coming in have a huge array of backgrounds. Some of them may be have a computer science or mathematics first degree and are coming straight in from it. Others may have been A&E nurses and then worked in Belmarsh and then came in later. Others may not have even done A-levels or maths since the GCSE level in the UK. So we're aware of that. There is no demand that you suddenly be able to solve a system of partial differential equations. We do start at the beginning. We provide extra support and tutorials from the beginning. So for those of you who know how to program already, have used GIS or know maths, and that's fine. For those of you who do not know what GIS or R is, we start right at the beginning and build you up. Anyone else? Again, just put in the chat. It can be private message, a public message, or feel free to unmute yourself. Or I can tell another earthquake story if you want. So yeah, Japan is interesting for earthquakes. So I mentioned that one in September 2003, but of course the big one was 11th March 2011. One of the top 5 earthquakes in terms of intensity that we've ever measured. You would feel that, and boy, did they feel that on that day, 11th March 2011. It was massive. And despite Tokyo being several hundred kilometers away from the epicenter, high rises in Tokyo were swaying back and forth in the earthquake. That in itself is not a problem because none of them collapsed. In fact, they were designed to sway back and forth in an earthquake so that they would stand up. If they didn't do that, then there would have been thousands of deaths. So some people got seasick, yeah, but there weren't mass casualties. This shows what we can do to prepare for an earthquake, to deal with earthquakes. And in fact, that day would have been a massive success for Japan, except for the tsunami. So the lack of readiness for tsunami compared to earthquake absolutely showed the difference between hazard and vulnerability. And an absolutely appalling disaster in Japan, over 15,000 dead from the tsunami, whereas the earthquake went fine despite it being a massive, massive event. It shows what we can do when we want to and what happens when we don't, which is why vulnerability, not hazard, causes disaster. And Alex, do you want to respond to the question in the chat?
Hi, yeah, sorry. It's Arcgis that we use. I think QGIS is the free package, but I think they're very, very similar. I've never actually used QGIS. But obviously you get that through the university, so you don't have to pay for it. You just sign up and you get to use it. So it's a great time to take advantage of that, really, as I'm sure it's quite an expensive package. I'm actually using it for my dissertation. I've not heard of Starter. Maybe Ilan, you could. I didn't have to learn that, and then it was our studio that we had still project analysing data using R.
So yeah, so R is the one which is part of the modules. SPSS and Stata you may use depending on the type of dissertation that you're doing. Those again are available through UCL, but they're not requirements. It would just depend. Are you doing the type of independent project or dissertation which requires the software? Do you wish to use them? Or if you don't know how to use them, do you wish to learn them? Otherwise, there's plenty of other ones available. So as we're approaching the top of the hour, I'll sort of say thank you and end the formal session. I'll stop the recording, but then I'll stick around for a few minutes after if anyone wants to chat informally. But just to say thank you again for joining this IRDR taster lecture. It will go on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. Feel free to search for my name, join me on any social media you use. I'm happy to interact. Or if you want sort of the old technique of email, I mean, that works too. And hoping to see you at the end of September to start your Master of Disaster. Thank you.